Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Andrew Heyman, and I'll be reviewing the topic of metabolic triads. This was a system that was developed by myself and Dr. James Laval over 30 years of working in the field of integrative medicine. This is an approach that we decided to create based on what we saw were the more important aspects of the functional medicine arena, but also in recognizing some of the deficiencies and drawbacks of that approach as well. For those of you who have not been introduced to some of the details of functional medicine, this is an approach that begins to evaluate some of the underlying metabolic drivers of a patient's illness complex. And while this sort of treatment of how we understand our patients at the metabolic level makes some sense, it's also complicated and at times even unwieldy in the sense of how do we apply it, where do I start, what's meaningful, what's not meaningful. And so Jim and I really focused on what were the more important aspects of evaluating an individual's metabolism, looking at the levers that we could push to create meaningful change in our patients, and refocus the functional medicine model into these sort of subunits that I think are much more consistent with the literature as well. It's a way then of characterizing the complexity of our patient's metabolism into a more condensed framework, one that has high utilitarian value, and I think will accelerate your understanding of how to look at your patients from this perspective. So, what are the key tenets of aging and illness that we look at through the metabolic triad model? We know that there are core issues around oxidative stress and inflammation. These are sort of the twin flames that drive the engine of every cell in the body. We need oxidative stress. We need inflammation, both of which are appropriate at certain levels. But excess oxidative stress, which essentially is rusting of cell metabolism, or excess inflammation, which can often drive a catabolic state inside the cell and therefore create cell damage, in their excess ends up being a real problem and is thought to be a key factor for accelerated aging. For the anti-aging advocates, their belief is that hormonal balance is key to a healthy life, and that's true to some degree. We know our hormones decline over time as we age, and that's a normal part of life. The theory is that if we can restore hormones to youthful states, then we should have youthful vitality as well. There are some issues with that, but hormonal balance overall is actually quite important, and we'll talk about that through the lens of the metabolic triad system. Stress hormones, this is an important area we address quite deeply throughout the integrative graduate program, both on a physiological as well as psychological level. Stress in all of its forms is important for our health and vitality, but we can also have overwhelming stress, which will have a tremendous impact on just about every body system. One of its related functions in comparison to stress and cortisol on a metabolic level is its impact on glucose and insulin regulation. These are two very important hormones in the way that we sort of manage our life and lifestyle. And stress has a lot to do with glucose control, and in turn, glucose and insulin regulation also modifies the stress response. Insulin is the hormone that drives our body's ability to manage carbohydrates effectively or not. And these two hormones together are very, very important for restoring normal, healthy metabolism. Additionally, immune balance. I think more and more we're beginning to see the consequences of lives that are stressful, that have abnormal glucose regulation. We have exposures to toxins and environmental chemicals and pollutants, and we live lives that tend to overwhelm our immune system. And what happens is that these sorts of external factors can lead to not only inflammation, but even more importantly, loss of immune tolerance. And this means that the body is beginning to lose its ability to distinguish between self and not self. It accounts for the rise of autoimmune diseases. It accounts for the rising tide of cancer and the reason why cancer is becoming as ubiquitous or common as heart disease. And of course, immune balance, sort of in the form of inflammation, stands at the core of many chronic illnesses. So, as much as hormonal balance in all of its forms is important, certainly so too is immune regulation. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about immune status in our patients and what to do about it. I mentioned briefly environmental burden. I think more and more we're recognizing the impact of exposures in terms of human health and physiology. This comes in a variety of forms and flavors. The two big categories that we tend to focus on are heavy metals and organic pollutants, although you could characterize all sorts of other toxins, if you'd like to call them that, that exist in our environment, whether it's from cell phones or EMF or so on and so forth, which I think are a little not as well characterized, but certainly probably has some import on our human health. And then, of course, there's the whole individuality component. This gets into the new or emerging field of omics, genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and also a sprinkling of epigenetics. All of those sort of ideas together form the field of omics, and that is to say, what is the machinery that underlies our metabolism? It's an enormously interesting but also incredibly complex area that we will touch on in one of our courses, but we'll try and do it in a way where for the non-scientists in the group, it still will be somewhat understandable and hopefully interesting. It's sort of the coming attractions of where medicine is going, and that is to say, how do we individualize our understanding of our patients and then further create specific treatment plans for them. I think that most of this is still existing in the preclinical stages. There are some things that we can do in terms of interventions, but oftentimes I hear overstatements in our field with regard to what we say we understand about genomics in particular and all of the SNP testing that's available, the 23andMe test, for example, and if we can just understand methylation from a genetic level and what sort of our genetic potential is from that perspective, we can turn on or turn off certain gene sequences, and that's just not quite true. Our genes and gene activity itself is very complicated and subject to all sorts of external forces. For example, what you ate this morning has something to do with what your genes are doing today. And so while we're learning more and more about how genetics plays a role in individual health, it's not quite ready for prime yet. So what dictates inflammation? Underlying metabolism, and metabolism sort of in all of its forms, especially when it becomes deranged in some way, often leads to inflammation of one sort or another, which we know stands at the core of many chronic illnesses. So we define metabolism as the sum total of all chemical reactions driving chemistry towards health or disease. And you can see around the outside of the circle these sort of external factors that tend to impinge on our metabolism, whether it's stress or sleep, nutrition, medications, behaviors, external toxins, which then influence hormones, oxidative stress, inflammatory response. All of this is very important sort of as a sum total of how we understand our metabolism. And obviously there are many, many more factors than just on what's on this slide, but this begins to characterize what we're looking at in our patients. And why all of this is important from a systems biology perspective is that even from the functional medicine approach, it still, I think, doesn't really honor in very specific ways the sort of intrinsic relationships that we see between various aspects of our metabolism. And I think what's interesting about this notion from a systems biology approach is that what we're really looking at are patterns of change that occur within our physiology. And these patterns arise from various systems interacting with each other in specific ways that yield sort of metabolic patterns that lead to symptom complexes. And from a traditional medical perspective, we don't do this. So as a physician, we're trained to sort of cut up the patient into body systems. So the cardiologists get the heart, the endocrinologists get the hormones, the gastroenterologists get the GI tract, and rarely do we have a clinical model where we look at the crosstalk between and among various systems. But that's exactly how our bodies are designed. And from my perspective, having originally been trained in traditional Chinese medicine, where the entire sort of structural framework of not only this healing approach, but basically all world healing traditions, they started from the notion that the body is this ecosystem, a system of systems, in fact, where one part essentially talks to another part. And that just because you have excess in one approach or one system process doesn't mean that that's necessarily the problem, that it might be arising from an imbalance elsewhere within our ecosystem in a sense. And when we start thinking this way and looking at the patterns that arise in our patients from a systems biology perspective, it opens up a whole new world in the way that we understand what we're looking at. And it actually helps to better recognize more quickly and more accurately often complex patients. And one example of that is the relationship between stress research and inflammation. And this is a big area that I'm particularly interested in, and more specifically from a metabolic perspective, it's the relationship between cortisol, which is our stress hormone, and factors within our immune system. And this slide talks specifically about TNF-alpha, which is an immune marker that's been under heavy research for a number of years. And when you look at this relationship, you begin to see that, in fact, there is a strong overlap between when we see stress-related abnormalities and the kinds of chronic illnesses that arise. And so too, the same sorts of things that occur when we have abnormalities in TNF-alpha levels. And what I would go on to say is that, in fact, one way to understand this relationship is that, in fact, cortisol is the main brake or modulator of the immune system from a hormonal perspective. So when cortisol levels are high, we tend to see suppression of the immune response. And that makes sense. As a physician, if you prescribe prednisone, we do that as an anti-inflammatory, which is, of course, the pharmaceutical derivative of cortisol. This is why we prescribe it. And conversely, when we have low states of cortisol, we don't have adequate brake or regulation on the immune response, and we typically see an overexuberant immune system, one that is unregulated and often has a predisposition to autoimmunity, that there's a loss of immune tolerance as a result of low cortisol levels. And so there's this teeter-totter relationship between two sides of the same coin. And so when we have patients that are under high levels of stress and their cortisol levels are elevated, it typically means that overall their immune system is suppressed, especially on the adaptive side of the immune system. There are different changes that occur on the innate side that I'll get into later. But by and large, one way to understand this is that when patients have high cortisol levels, they tend to be immunosuppressed in a relative sense. But the converse is true. If they have long-term changes in their stress response, this can liberate the immune system. There are important reasons why this occurs, but suffice it to say, these are two bodily processes. They're in constant communication with each other. This is the core notion of this construct that we've developed around the idea of the triads. And it's important to understand these bodily processes in their context of how does one activity of physiology integrate and affect other activities of physiology? And when we look at our patients from that perspective, it really does open up a new way of evaluating our patients and understanding what we're looking at. So metabolic medicine or functional medicine, sort of this notion of let's evaluate our patient's metabolism, attempts to explain processes and interconnectedness of the whole body. This then harkens back to traditional healing methods, but begins to overlay a metabolic framework on what's been observed over thousands of years. And so we want to create this sort of synergy between the observable and the measurable. And the triad model is a simplified way of evaluating that in patients, yet grounded in very strong evidence and has tremendous clinical utility. You will be seeing that in the way that you utilize our online systems and programs. It's the way that I want you to think from a metabolic perspective, and we're giving you tools and support both intellectually as well as technologically to begin to shift your awareness in this regard and to start looking at the body in terms of pattern recognition. The air support system in particular will help you organize data. For your perspective as a student learner, you'll be able to input questionnaire-based data, and it will help you focus your thinking with regard to which triad might be imbalanced in this patient. Now, without clinical data, without biologic measurements, if you're not able to order labs, there obviously will be some real guesswork in terms of what might be going on with patients if you're not able to order labs. You're welcome to, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while, but if you're not able to, that's fine. The system itself will help you organize information as you enroll patients on the air support platform and begin to focus your thinking around specific triads. And the idea is that you want to look at where are the areas of imbalance. How do I know where a patient is today? What is their predictive risk for the future? And how do I decrease negative forces on their metabolic processes? So the idea is, where do I start? How do I characterize these patients? And what are some prudent treatment methods to intervene on patients over time? So the triad analysis, born of 30 years of research and experience, really probably 60 between myself and James Laval. We have an entire science-based team that has developed this over time and refined it. We're constantly surveying the literature or looking at these systems biology relationships and linking them to meaningful clinical choices. And the goal is to look at an organized method to capture where the metabolic weakness is and allow for this sort of systems-based approach in terms of understanding where our patients are at, where they're going, and how to make good decisions for treatment. So the objectives of this sort of whole approach, as we immerse ourselves into the world of triads over the course of 6210, is to have you understand the underlying patterns of physiology related to each triad and what are the common pathological patterns that arise when each triad becomes imbalanced. We'll review common patient presentations within each triad and then help you develop successful clinical approaches based on triad disturbances. Additionally, we look to enhance your clinical skill set by talking to patients, enrolling them on the system, having them complete the questionnaire, focusing on the lifestyle issues in terms of nutrition and exercise and stress management, in addition to their metabolic disturbances, to help you develop very specific individualized plans for your patients. So this is a very organized approach to a blend of all that is, I think, effective within sort of integrative medicine proper, but also invoking this idea of metabolism and sort of functional medicine, but in a framework that makes sense for the practitioner and the patient. We also focus, and you know this, on dietary strategies to enhance patient outcomes. This you'll be doing through the Lifestyle Guidance Portal or MyFitnessPal. You've had a lot of reading on nutrition, dietary selection, appropriate diet therapy, and then getting tools into the hands of your patients to ensure success. We then blend that with your learning around how do I sustain healthy behaviors over time in my patients? How do I track them? So all of this becomes sort of the world of the metabolic code in a sense, and that is all of the aspects of a better or more detailed understanding of where your patients are at, how do I support them over time, and individualize an approach to care. And then later on in the course, we'll talk about in other sections, business strategies to support your clinical decision making, which I think is very, very important. So why triads? Define physiologic relationships. There's quite a lot of research support. You'll see that in terms of my expectations of you, for each triad, and there are 5 of them, I will want you to go to the literature and look for some of the research that supports the interconnectedness of how these triads were built or constructed. So, for example, the first triad includes 3 hormones: cortisol, insulin, and thyroid. And this really has to do with stress, the rate of metabolism, and blood sugar control. So there is a huge amount of research on what happens to the thyroid, for example, when people are under stress, or why is there this bidirectional relationship between glucose control and stress and resiliency. There are important reasons why there is a strong interconnectedness between these 3 hormones, which I'll talk about, but I'll also want you to go to the research and develop a slide deck of just 10 slides that begins to articulate the underlying evidence for each of the triads. And I think you'll be surprised at how much work has been done in this regard. You may have to search a little bit, but it shouldn't be too difficult. We use the triads because the number 3, meaning there's always 3 elements to each of these systems as we've defined them, is simple. And yet it's also very clinically relevant, whether it's on a purely hormonal level between insulin, cortisol, or thyroid, or on a whole body system level between the gut, the immune system, and the brain. I think you'll find that there's a tremendous amount of utility as we begin to organize this information in very specific ways. And it'll allow you to break your patients down into these pots of information. And you'll realize that you can look at a complex patient and begin to evaluate their patterns relatively quickly. And as you get better at this process, you'll find that oftentimes you won't even really need lab values, that if you listen to your patient, they'll tell you which triads are imbalanced in a sense. And we have found that this ability to deconstruct difficult patients is so tremendously helpful, both for the person who's new to this approach, but also for someone who's relatively seasoned, but along the way has gotten lost in the complexity of the functional medicine model, which has its own power, but we have felt that it needs to be better organized for the active practitioner. And ultimately then what we want to do is have you develop these sort of psychological frameworks that create clinical success, so that from a utilitarian perspective, it allows you to gather information, organize it based on the evidence, characterize it for yourself and your patients, and develop very specific treatment plans based on this metabolic model that you'll develop some real confidence in. And we've seen this transform practices, even for seasoned physicians or practitioners who've been doing integrative and functional medicine and anti-aging for many, many, many years, but just didn't have an organized way of sort of putting all the pieces together. And so why did we do this? We did this because when you really look at underlying metabolism or physiology, it's incredibly complicated. And you can see that, on a certain sort of intellectual level, every bodily process usually has some relationship to almost every other bodily process. But how do we make sense of all of this information? Where do we start? Do we start in the gut? Do we start in the immune system? Do we start with hormones? Should we detoxify patients? Do we start with the stress response? Do we deal with diet? Should we get them to sleep better or move more? So sort of so on and so forth. And so what we're doing is we're trying to break down these bits and pieces of interconnectedness into a unified theory with these subdomains, or triads as we call them, that makes it easy to understand. And of course, there are key relationships within a triad, again, for example, between stress, thyroid, and insulin, or gut, immune, brain. But of course, there are interrelationships between triads or among triads, which we call stacking. And that is to say, you can have an imbalance among several or even all of the triads as a person's metabolism is becoming more and more impaired. And this is when people transition from these sort of functional metabolic disturbances and they begin to develop real chronic illnesses or acute illnesses for that matter. So there's this cut point between functional alterations in metabolism and when we begin to express real disease. And the goal of all of this is to gather enough information on our patients so that we can intervene early in the process where there are these disturbances that are relatively simple to intervene on and correct. Because as physiology becomes more and more impaired and sort of denser in its expression of imbalance, and we go from sort of functional to physical or structural, these patients, of course, become harder to treat. So endothelial dysfunction in the cardiovascular tree ultimately arises with cardiovascular disease, so thickening of the arteries in a sense. So we go from functional to structural, and once those structural changes occur, it's much harder to correct or intervene. It's not impossible, but it's just harder. And again, all of this is to sort of begin to categorize where are these relationships occurring within complex metabolism that are really important, not just from an evidence perspective, but from a clinical perspective, that we have to tie together the evidence that we now know around systems biology to a utilitarian approach that allows you to make good decisions. So what are the five triads? The first one is adrenal, thyroid, pancreas, or stress, metabolism, sugar. These are essentially three hormones that drive energy in the body. There's also gut, immune, brain, so three bodily systems. Liver, lymph, kidney, which are drainage organs. Cardiopulmonary neurovascular, this is the direct relationship between the brain and the heart, mediated through the autonomic nervous system. And then finally, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, which are reproductive hormones that engender sort of potency, reproducibility, and a sense of vitality in the world. So the first triad, adrenal, thyroid, pancreas, has to do with, again, stress, metabolism, and sugar. All three hormones produce energy in the body, and they circulate that energy in very key ways. From a patient perspective, I always talk about this in terms of stress, metabolism, and sugar. That oftentimes when we're under stress, it creates a sluggish metabolism because it impairs our thyroid and we have lowered ATP production. And in turn, we see alterations in blood sugar response. So usually we have carbohydrate cravings, swings in energy throughout the day as our insulin goes high and then low, which in turn impairs our stress response. So the body actually makes more cortisol to deal with swings in blood sugar. And when we have changes in insulin and changes in cortisol, this in turn impairs thyroid function. So around and around we go. And we can have early imbalances within adrenal, thyroid, pancreas, and these can accumulate over time to deepen their pathology and eventually arise in diabetes and Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, and significantly impaired stress response, and so on and so forth. These three hormones are incredibly important to regulate our physiology. We have receptors for all three hormones all over the body. And when they're normal, when people are eating well, they're dealing with stress in their environment, and they have plenty of energy to get throughout the day or move throughout the day, and they sleep deeply at night, people feel vital and well. But if we are reaching for carbohydrates and our blood sugar is climbing and we have an impaired stress response and we're losing motivation and energy, typically patients will present with symptoms of fatigue and obesity, that they're gaining weight, they're tired, they're not sleeping well. And the way I think about it is this triad in particular is the underlying machinery for lifestyle medicine. It's nutrition, it's exercise, it's stress management, it's how do we deal in the world, it's our meaning and purpose. And when this particular triad is imbalanced, we have some significant issues with energy production, which often results in gain. The second triad, gut, immune, brain, has to do with three bodily systems that are really tightly tied together. It's the digestive tract, it's the immune system, both adaptive and innate, and then it's the central nervous system, and how these three bodily processes or organ systems connect with each other. They are so tightly tied together that they're really considered one unit when you look at the research. And it's easy. You can just Google gut immune axis or gut brain axis. It is amazing how much research is coming out looking at the relationship between the complexity of the digestive tract, how this interfaces with the immune system. We have 60 to 70%, maybe even up to 80% of all immune cells lining the digestive tract, interrelated to digestion in very key ways. And then we have an entire nerve system complex that resides in the middle of this relationship. In fact, so much so that we call it our second brain, that there is many nerves in the gut as in the spinal cord, and that each of these systems have programmed or complex thinking involved, if you want to look at it that way, meaning the gut has to decide what to take in and let go. The immune system has to decide what to let into the body, attack or not attack, self, not self. And then the brain on a psychological level, in terms of me, not me. So this system is really about safe borders and boundaries, the ability to sort of take in life and let it go appropriately, when to respond and react to threats or not, and how these systems marshal around those threats. And usually it's all three together. One key relationship that certainly has gotten a lot of play is just the role of gluten. That gluten triggers the immune system, and it's not uncommon for people to have depression or anxiety and fatigue as a result of a gluten intolerance. So that's a very simple explanation or model of how these systems interrelate, but it's exactly the way in which these three bodily processes interact with each other. So I think of gut immune brain as sort of primary command and control, all of the decision making that goes on in terms of safety and security in the world. It's about filtering, defense, and repair. These are major physiologic interfaces. And when there are normal borders and boundaries and things are organized in a way where we can take in nutrients, we can deal with toxins and invaders, that the brain is calm and focused and working on both the cognitive as well as subcognitive level, and these systems are organized, we feel secure in the world. We're nutritionally secure, we're immunologically secure, we're psychologically or cognitively secure. But when there's breakdown, when the gut doesn't know when to take in and when to let go, when the immune system is losing tolerance and the ability to distinguish between self and not self, and we're becoming inflamed or even autoimmune, and when the brain itself is becoming inflamed, the sort of notion of neuroinflammation, we feel disordered, and there's sort of this unpredictability. The third triad is liver, lymph, kidney. And in fact, just to let you know, we've reorganized these systems. So this is actually Triad 4. But nonetheless, liver, lymph, kidney is the drainage organs in the body. It's how we deal with toxins and its exposures. It's how we get rid of waste efficiently. And in turn, we can see how the body begins to fill up with heavy metals and chemicals, but also emotions and traumas, and how we deal with those over time. This is sort of that notion of medical toxicology, which finally is getting some good and legitimate recognition. So liver, lymph, kidney, it's sort of detoxification and elimination, redox potential and enzymatic activity. So it's the balance of inflammation and oxidative stress. It's our ability to process and remove these environmental pollutants. And when this occurs, we have smooth flow of substrates and emotions. And when they're in balance, we have inflammation, stagnation, and retention. Again, we flip these, so Triad 3 really is cardiopulmonary neurovascular. It's the relationship between the brain and the heart. And this is about sort of circulating nourishment around the body. Again, we look at the interconnectedness between the central nervous system and the cardiac system, which is somewhat mediated actually through lung function. I often see this as the heart of the triads because it's these two central organs that really control so much of physiology. And when they're normal, we have this sort of strength of spirit. And that is to say, we are strong in ourselves, we are strong in the world psychologically and emotionally as well as physiologically. But when we're imbalanced, these systems tend towards inflammation and spasm. So it's the vasculopath patient who is at risk for arrhythmias, for MI, for stroke. This is the triad where the ambulances show up. It's the dramatic ending for many of these patients. So as much as triad 3 or triad 2, forgive me, um, in terms of gut immune brain, will lead to irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune diseases, depression, and anxiety. These are the states of energy that tends to eat people up inside. So when triad 2 becomes imbalanced, it's this sort of slow dissolution of metabolism. And we know that there's this relationship between depression, gut dysfunction, and inflammation and autoimmunity that leads to this sort of quiet state of disrepair. And unfortunately also leads to severe psychological issues or even cancer, inflammatory bowel disease. But conversely, if triad 2 is about sort of being eaten up inside in a sense, when you look at the predominant diseases that arise out of cardiopulmonary neurovascular, as we migrate towards greater and greater states of dysfunction, it's arrhythmias, it's heart disease, it's stroke, it's sort of this more dramatic explosions of physiology in a sense. And yes, of course, there's heart failure and so on and so forth. But the sort of main energy of dysfunction in this particular triad is sort of that outward, very obvious state of disrepair. And it's interesting to see how the body organizes itself around these lines in a sense. But this is exactly what we see in patients. And then finally, triad 5, the reproductive hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So this is about potency, it's self-esteem, it's relationships, it's connectedness on an emotional level, a sexual level, a reproductive level. For men, it tends to be about production and reward, and for women, about reproduction and security. And of course, there's overlap with all of that between genders. But this is the triad that sort of characterizes potency and reproduction in the world. And when we lose potency, as our hormones decline over time, whether it's loss of testosterone in men or loss of estrogen, progesterone in women, we have this, and we see this in terms of loss of self-esteem, change in body composition, loss of emotional potency, psychological potency, and certainly loss of the ability to reproduce.